Imagine you are standing in the Palace of Versailles in the year 1786. Behind a silk tapestry, you hear the muffled screams of a child no older than 12, while the most powerful nobles in France take turns engaging in what they call the evening amusement. The giggles of duchesses blend with the cries as they place bets on how long the child will endure. What you are about to uncover is not merely a tale of depravity. This is the hidden history of how the highest ideals of the Enlightenment were weaponized to become the justification for the most brutal crimes. The French aristocracy did not see themselves as criminals. They saw themselves as pioneers, free thinkers, pushing the boundaries of human experience. We will not rely on rumors. We will rely on the very ledgers, philosophical journals, and financial records they left behind. This is the story of how a civilization intoxicated by its own intellect forgot its humanity. The transformation of the French nobility into this nightmare did not happen overnight. It was the product of generations of idle wealth, absolute power, and a philosophical movement that confused intellectual sophistication with moral bankruptcy. They convinced themselves that their debauchery was, in fact, an expression of progressive thought, and the catalyst that turned personal depravity into an organized criminal enterprise emerged in 1748 with the founding of the Society of Free Thinkers. Founded by the Duke of Orleans and dozens of other high-ranking nobles, this was not a social club. This was a professional criminal organization operating behind the walls of a Parisian mansion, concealing activities so extreme that even corrupt police officials refused bribes to look the other way. Its members included the most powerful names in France: dukes, marquises, high-ranking clergymen, and wealthy merchants who paid enormous fees for the privilege of participating in what they called philosophical experiments. The Society's charter, discovered in a hidden vault during the Revolution, revealed their systematic nature. They kept detailed records of victims classified by age, gender, physical characteristics, and what they euphemistically called specialized training. They operated procurement networks spanning across Europe with agents in major cities whose sole job was to identify and acquire suitable subjects. The mansion itself was specifically designed for its horrific purpose. The main floor featured elegant salons where members would discuss philosophy, while selecting their evening entertainment from catalogs resembling livestock inventories. The cellars contained preparation rooms where victims were trained, and experiment rooms equipped with devices more suited to a torture chamber than a bedroom. But the Society's most creative contribution to aristocratic depravity was the systematization of what they called philosophical cruelty. Members were not merely interested in sexual gratification. They wanted to explore the philosophical implications of having absolute power over others. They kept detailed notes of their experiments, recording not only what they did to the victims, but also how the experience affected their own intellectual and emotional development. These journals, written in elegant French and bound in expensive leather, described calculated acts of brutality so disturbing that revolutionary prosecutors struggled to read them aloud in court. One member wrote extensively about his theory that inflicting suffering on children was in fact a form of education, preparing them for the harsh realities of life, while providing valuable insights into the nature of power and submission. Bored with ordinary debauchery, the members of the Society began experimenting with what they called living art, elaborate theatrical performances in which victims became unwilling actors in scripts designed to blend exploitation with aesthetic experience. These were not acts of spontaneous cruelty. They were meticulously choreographed productions requiring months of preparation and involving dozens of participants. Most famous among them was the Duke of Orleans' Garden of Earthly Delights, a recreation of Hieronymus Bosch's renowned painting in living form. Children and youths were arranged in a specially designed garden, their bodies painted and altered to match the nightmarish imagery of Bosch's masterpiece. The Society's members would stroll through this living painting, interacting with the characters, while discussing the philosophical implications of turning art into reality. The preparations for these performances were as horrific as the events themselves. Victims were kept in special rooms for weeks or months, their bodies gradually altered to fit the artistic vision. Some were starved to achieve a specific body shape. Others underwent procedures that permanently changed their appearance. The society maintained a staff of art consultants, essentially torture specialists, with knowledge of painting and sculpture. The Marquise de Prie, despite her reputation as a devout woman, created what she called sacred mysteries, religious-themed performances, combining Christian imagery with exploitation. Children would be dressed as angels while being forced to perform acts presented as religious rituals. Members of the society would participate while wearing clerical robes, producing blasphemous parodies of Catholic ceremonies. These performances became legendary among Europe's aristocracy. Wealthy nobles from as far as Russia and England would attend, bringing their own victims as gifts and commissioning customized productions. The society grew into a prosperous international enterprise with branches in major European capitals. But even the organized depravity of the society was only a prelude to the worst, what would happen when aristocratic debauchery received royal patronage. The turning point came when King Louis XIII, inspired by his own participation in the society, issued secret orders that effectively legalized aristocratic exploitation, provided it was carried out under the guise of philosophical research. This royal approval transformed the scattered vices of individual nobles into a systematic network that reached every level of French society. The king established the Office of Philosophical Research, a government agency whose official purpose was to advance human knowledge, but whose real function was to coordinate victim access for the aristocracy and ensure their activities remained hidden. This office operated with the efficiency of any other government agency, but its bureaucracy served horrors. They kept detailed records of victims' organized networks to transport people between aristocratic estates and provided legal protection for nobles whose activities resulted in inconvenient deaths or injuries. Under royal patronage, aristocratic depravity reached a scale that no individual could have achieved alone. The Duke of Orléans expanded his operations to multiple facilities across France. The Marquise de Pompadour established training academies where children were systematically prepared to serve the aristocracy. The office's most important contribution was the creation of what they called systematic documentation, detailed records of aristocratic activities, ostensibly for philosophical study, but in reality, blackmail material to ensure continued cooperation from participants. These files, filling dozens of volumes that survived the revolution, offer a window into organized exploitation on a scale that dwarfs anything in recorded history. By 1770, the network included more than 300 active participants across France, processing thousands of victims each year. But the same royal approval that allowed this horrific system to flourish also contained the seeds of its own destruction. The scale of their operations required infrastructure that could not be hidden from a population growing ever more enraged, watching their children disappear, while the aristocracy lived in unprecedented luxury. The victim procurement network's dependence on poverty and desperation reached crisis levels in the decade before the revolution. Families facing famine would sell their children to recruiters, promising domestic service positions only for them to be taken to facilities from which they would never be seen again. When revolutionaries uncovered the society's archives in 1792, they held in their hands evidence of crimes so systematic that many refused to believe the proof was genuine. The records included not only names and activities, but also financial accounts, correspondence with international partners, and detailed descriptions of facilities that resembled blueprints for industrial-scale human exploitation. The subsequent trials revealed a web of complicity stretching across French society. Nobles who had once considered themselves above the law suddenly faced prosecutors who had spent months reading aloud their own words describing the horrors they had committed. The contrast between their elegant self-justifications and the brutal reality of their actions created a public relations disaster that helped justify the extreme measures of the Reign of Terror. Many nobles, many facing certain execution, chose suicide rather than public exposure. The Duke of Orleans, realizing his own records, made any defense impossible, drank poison in his cell. The great reward we gain today is not merely knowing their crimes. The deepest insight is this: the French aristocracy were not unique monsters. They were ordinary humans, corrupted by unchecked power, and by the very philosophical frameworks they devised to justify its limitless use. They weaponized intellectual sophistication to excuse every cruelty. The revolution ultimately swept them away, not only for economic inequality, but for the moral outrage at a ruling class that had mistaken civilization for refined barbarity. Their story is an eternal warning of what happens when power faces no effective restraint. We have just seen how the French elite used philosophy and art to justify earthly sexual exploitation. They made their own rules. But another great empire, the Roman Empire, had a completely different approach. For them, sex was not a philosophical game, but a language of power, a rigid system of rules, defining who was a citizen and who was property, who was a ruler and who was ruled. If you want to step into a world where phalluses were worn as charms, where emperors married men, and where the question was never who do you sleep with, but what did you do to them, then you must watch our next video. Click right now on the video appearing on screen, the most bizarre sexual practices of the Roman Empire, to decode an entirely different sexual operating system where every act was a statement of status.